Welcome to Newsday. I'm Kasia, Madera in London. Our headlines. One of the world's architectural wonders, Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, has been left in ruins by a devastating fire. These are the live pictures from the French capital, where the cathedral has been burning for many, many hours. The blaze has destroyed much of the cathedral's roof. This is the moment that the main spire of this 850-year-old building collapsed. These are the first pictures of the devastation inside the cathedral, where investigators are trying to establish the severity of the damage to the structure and to its contents.
I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Also in this special edition of Newsday, President Emmanuel Macron has been to the scene. He promised the cathedral will be rebuilt.
The worst has been avoided, even if the battle isn't won yet.
Thousands have been watching in tears and dismay as this symbol of Paris goes up in flames.
Live from our studios in London and Singapore. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Newsday. It's 1 in the morning here in London, it's 8 in the morning in Singapore, and it is 2 o'clock in the morning in Paris, where a major fire has engulfed one of France's most famous landmarks, the medieval Cathedral of Notre-Dame. Notre-Dame has stood on the banks of the River Seine for 850 years. Well, tonight the fires are being brought under control. Officials say that the main structure has been saved. These are the live shots now where water continues to pour in to bring the heat under control. The devastation is immense. One firefighter has been seriously injured and huge crowds have been gathering in the streets, many of them in tears. Earlier, President Macron promised that Notre-Dame Cathedral will be rebuilt. Our Paris correspondent, Lucy Williamson, begins our coverage.
It was, said the President, a part of France that burned today. A part that stood here for 800 years, through war, revolution and religious unrest. Engulfed within an hour by flames. Its ancient towers, beacons for both residents and tourists, crumbling into the blaze. As its current guardian watched through tears.
This is a national disaster. I'm very upset. This cathedral is 850 years old, and to see the building fall to pieces, the spire fall down, just as we were renovating it, all I can do is pray.
Firefighters circled the cathedral to tackle the blaze, their cranes stretching to reach its soaring roof. A complicated and fragile operation. Simply dousing the medieval structure with water was not an option, rescue experts said, because the building could collapse. To tackle the flames inside the building, firefighters had to climb up the towers. Nothing else could reach. President Macron arriving at the cathedral with France's Prime Minister, his face upturned in disbelief.
Ce qui s'est passé ce soir à Paris et dans cette cathédrale Notre-Dame.
What's happened tonight in Paris and Notre-Dame is a terrible event. I want to first thank the firefighters, 500 of whom have battled the flames for several hours, and will keep doing so for several more, and maybe for several days.
The flames are slowly beginning to subside now, but the damage is just beginning to reveal itself. The destruction of this medieval symbol of Paris has left the city under a pall of shock and smoke. People packed into the streets around barely spoke, just watched. Those who found the words for their impressions, one after the other, all said the same.
This is awful. It's terribly sad. It's terrifying. The fire is uncontrollable. I've been here for 1 hour and there's nothing we can do.
The Deputy Mayor of Paris confirmed the fire had started on the roof and quickly spread. The cause isn't clear. Police have begun an investigation. But some have questioned whether extensive renovation work currently underway here might have sparked this massive blaze. The task now is to assess the destruction inside the building. its woodwork dating from the 13th century, its statues destroyed once before by revolutionaries 2 centuries ago. Many things are said to be irreplaceable: great art, cultural heritage, symbols of protection and hope. What word should we use when it's all of these? Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
So as Paris comes to terms with what has happened to Notre-Dame, let's have a look at some of the first images coming in from inside this 850-year-old interior cathedral. These are the first images that we've received here at the BBC newsroom, and we can see that the devastation, the fire that was raging in the roof of this particular part of the cathedral, although it looks absolutely dramatic, and we saw the flames coming up on the outside, the devastation within the inside is actually looking not as bad as initially had been feared. The firefighters were able to keep the walls wet, and so the fire didn't spread as much as had initially been feared. Of course, the investigation teams will be coming in the morning to assess this situation, and water is still continually being doused. But as you can see, the devastation right now is, well, it's not looking too dreadful. It's, of course, it's a terrible situation, but it is salvageable, and the stone is secure, we're being told. Many of the relics, these absolutely priceless when it comes to what they mean in terms of religion, relics that have been taken out, including the crown of thorns and also a piece of the true cross. Some of the most revered relics that had been housed within Notre-Dame, they were removed. Many artworks had been removed, but these are some of the first images that we're seeing from the inside, from seeing the devastation, where we can see the stone structure at least is secure, and well, hopefully that some kind of salvage operation will be able to start. So those are the images from inside. Let's have a little look at what is happening outside, because like I say, one of the concerns that my colleague Kevin Connolly was saying earlier is that the heat that had been created from the fire itself, that needs to be brought down. The stone is hot, and so firefighters will continue to pour water into the building to bring the heat down in order to stop any possible fire re-establishing itself. This is absolutely crucial, and this is now, as you can see, 2 o'clock in the morning local time, and yet firefighters still working throughout the night. Sadly, one firefighter has been injured, but just unbelievably nobody else hurt in what has been an absolutely devastating day for Paris, for France. And what we believe is that the cathedral was closed earlier than normal today, possibly due to events leading up in the run-up to Holy Week. So the cathedral was closed a little bit earlier on, so people, the tourists, the thousands of tourists that come to see this iconic building every single day, were being ushered out to leave, and then the fire kind of took hold, and then the flames that we saw, and then the spire falling in within the building itself. So the images outside right now, like I say, Kevin Connolly has been on site. He's been talking to me a little bit earlier, and he just described the events a short time ago.
Well, you can probably see behind me that Notre-Dame Cathedral, this glorious miracle of medieval architecture and engineering, its basic structure, the shape of it as we've always recognised it, still visible against the dark skyline here. You might be able to make out that water is still being poured in. The job of the firefighters now is to make sure that the fire can't re-establish itself somewhere in the depths of that building, and also to bring down the very high temperature of the stone and the woodwork inside. Tomorrow comes the work of course, establishing what caused the fire and the first assessment of how long it will take to repair the damage and how much it will cost. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, the nature of these buildings. Notre-Dame took nearly 200 years to build. It was, as I say, a miracle of the medieval era. It won't take that long to repair, but this is a tremendous historical moment in the life of a building, which in some ways tells the story of the whole of France. Think about this. That's the building in which Napoleon was consecrated as emperor here, and at that point, early in the 19th century, Notre-Dame was nearly 500 years old already. So that's the antiquity of the building. That's the extent to which it's woven into the heart and the story of France. So that's the scale of the emotional impact that Lucy was describing in her report there. It's why there are still crowds around me here. It's 1 o'clock in the morning in Paris. People are still looking to see what is happening to the building, what tomorrow will bring. So it's an enormous moment in French history. You know, President Emmanuel Macron was due to make a speech tonight about politics, a kind of response to the yellow vest protests that we've been seeing in France over recent months. He cancelled that speech, came here instead and spoke about this cathedral, what it means to the French people and what will have to be done now it's been so badly damaged.
Kevin, of course, the morning will bring new investigations as to what happened, but there was a lot of concern that there weren't more firefighters there early on.
I think you're always going to get criticism of these kind of operations at this sort of moment. No one is ever going to feel that enough is being done. I think to some extent, I think that tells you how strongly attached the French are to this building and how strongly they feel that everything should have been done to save it. So actual assessments of the quality of those security operations, firefighting operations, that I think will take some time. The immediate task here, as I say, is some kind of assessment of the damage, some kind of assessment of what you do in the short term to shore up the structure and in the longer term to repair it, to bring it back to viability, to have it again as a central place in worship, in Catholic worship, of course. It's recognised all around the world, and also what it will take to restore it to its centrality at the heart of Paris and in the life of France. That is a huge historical undertaking. We think an appeal will be launched tomorrow, a kind of public subscription. And so the French, I think, will be able to feel, France will be able to feel that the work of reconstruction, at least in principle, begins tomorrow, even though an enormous task now clearly lies ahead, as you can see when you look at that building in the darkness behind me.
There had been appeals for money to help with the restoration, so I guess now those appeals will be strengthened.
They will. I mean, this is going to be now an enormous national and I think international appeal. This is an important building for Catholics all over the world as well as for the French. You know, you think about its centrality at the heart of French life. I'm told that every distance marker in every town and village in France that gives you a distance to Paris is measured from Notre-Dame Cathedral. It is 0.0 for France. It is the marker against which everything else is calibrated. So I imagine that appeal will be an easy one to launch. It has every prospect of success, but the scale of the task shouldn't be underestimated. The fabric of Notre-Dame, like the fabric of lots of medieval cathedrals in Europe, has been deteriorating over a very, very, very long time. That presumably, I think, will ultimately be found by investigation to be one of the reasons why the building itself caught fire, has been so badly damaged. That, the potential for disaster has always been there in the steady deterioration over time. So an immense task it lies ahead of France to restore this building, because of course a proper restoration is going to have to restore the character of Notre-Dame as it always has been. And in the modern world, finding people with the necessary skills in stone and woodwork to reproduce the glories of medieval Europe is not going to be easy.
It's an absolutely staggering scene behind you, the devastation. Of course, you touched upon the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. They were due to regroup this weekend, following on from what Mr. Emmanuel Macron would have said tonight. He didn't speak. Do you know if those protests will now, out of respect, not go ahead?
I think it's far too early to even start thinking about that, is the truth. I don't think even the people involved will have begun to think about that, or how this connects into their protests, or how it connects into the life of modern France. This is going to be perceived, standing alone, as a moment of national disaster, a cold moment at the heart of France that is going to give the French, as I say, the challenge of a huge task of recovery. So I think It's something that almost stands apart from the world of day-to-day politics, however intense that's been here in the last few months. And I think, as I say, Emmanuel Macron was due to make that big political speech tonight on national television. He came down here and spoke to the nation instead. And I think a lot of French people will feel captured very well the role that this building, this religious institution has always played in the heart of France, and how important it was to save it, to avoid the worst of the damage, and how important it will be in the future to rebuild it. So he addressed himself to those central themes in his speech, and I think they're the political themes that French people will be picking up tomorrow.
Kevin Connolly, he was speaking to me about an hour beforehand, before we got the most recent pictures from inside the cathedral. Also earlier, the freelance journalist Seamus Kearney had been watching events unfold outside Notre-Dame. I spoke to him and he told us about the very beginning of this fire.
Yes, I can tell you, absolute shock still here tonight. It's more than 5 hours after that blaze broke out, and still thousands of people gathered around the Ile de la Cité, just absolute disbelief at what they're looking at. Notre-Dame, just the two towers standing and the facades, but really this enormous damage that we're likely to only really understand tomorrow. What kind of damage? Is it totally gutted, for example, inside? I was actually in a cafe just nearby when the first alerts were sounded. We just saw small puffs of smoke actually rising from the top of Notre-Dame. And I actually spoke to one family who had just been inside the cathedral. They were there right up until the closing time, but today the cathedral closed early, 6:45. We understand the blaze broke out shortly after that. And I actually looked at some of the photographs taken by that family from the US, and they had a whole series of photographs, and we saw that there was just the splendor of the cathedral, the normal tourist photograph. And then about 5 or 6 photographs later, you can see the small puff of smoke rising. They actually thought it was the construction work that was underway, because the smoke was very close to the scaffolding, very close to the part of the roof where the construction work is taking place. And it was amazing. We actually started to move towards the cathedral. There were big crowds moving towards the cathedral, and I can actually tell you that there were just as many people rushing away from the cathedral. Many people concerned that this may have been some kind of attack. Of course, Paris still on a high level of security alert. But people moved towards the cathedral, and those flames just absolutely took off so quickly. And even an hour after the blaze began, there were just no signs of firefighter hoses. It just seemed like the fire was just totally out of control. It moved so quickly, and it spread up that spire so fast, and there was real concern that it was going to fall onto some of the historic nearby buildings. In the end, after about 20 minutes after the fire first took hold, the spire fell right into the middle of the cathedral, and that's why I think the damage inside is going to be quite significant.
Seamus, when we look at the images, the intensity of the fire is absolutely staggering. Right now, just to brief our viewers, we believe there is still a small fire within the building, but most of it has been contained. And from our understanding is the worst has been avoided. So the structure of the building is, in theory, okay. But when we look at what happened earlier on today, the intensity of the fire is really, really worrying.
That's right, and the flames were just shooting up so high. I took some photographs and shared those, and people were just staggered to see those. You're right, I'm actually standing right in front of the cathedral, just across the River Seine, and I can tell you that there are still flickers of flames from within. There are still firefighters with the mechanical aerial ladders trying to put out those flames. One thing that was very interesting when the fire was taking hold, when it was really at its height, was that people were screaming out, saying, "Where are the helicopters? Where are the aerial ladders?" And this was an hour after the blaze first started. Some people were trying to say, look, it'll be impossible for the firefighters to get so close. The access to very small streets, a lot of tourists in that area as well. And firefighters tonight have been saying that it was very difficult, that there were a lot of dangers. There were dangers to surrounding buildings. But people, they were screaming out, "Where are the helicopters?" And that was just absolutely astonishing, just total disbelief. And we do hear tonight from the French authorities saying that, yes, the structure has been saved. We still see the two towers there standing. We see the stone facades. But I have heard some experts who were interviewed around me saying that, it's only going to really be in the next week or two when tests are carried out to see whether or not that historic facade, whether the stonework has been damaged, whether or not it's going to be too fragile to even think about rebuilding. But tonight we've heard from the French president saying that, total catastrophe has been avoided. He's pledging there will be a rebuild. And just looking at all of these people around here tonight, it's after midnight, tens of thousands still gathered here in silence, just looking at this empty skyline here across the River Seine.
Seamus, let's take advantage of the fact that you were there from the very beginning. We believe that the works of art, the religious icons, the countless artefacts that are within the cathedral, that they were taken out. Did you see any of that that process?
No, but I actually spoke to an official who came across from the cathedral to be interviewed by television stations. He did confirm that some artifacts had been taken out. Now, we don't know at what stage, whether it was by firefighters or by people who worked in the cathedral. But as I say, it was closing early tonight, and that may have been very, very lucky indeed, because the tourists were already on their way out, and perhaps they managed to get to a lot of those artifacts. I know that this official I heard talking in French, he was talking about a crown that had been saved. I'm not quite sure which crown he was referring to, but we do know that a lot of the very precious artwork is just absolutely massive, huge paintings. It's impossible to imagine that all of the artifacts and all of the treasures will have been saved. And people here, are talking about visiting the cathedral today, looking at a lot of that artwork, and just really this anxiety now, just to know what's going to be, what are we going to find tomorrow once the firefighters have managed to totally put out the flames. Going inside, we understand that the roof collapsed, the spire fell right inside the cathedral, but does that mean that the actual stone ceiling inside the cathedral, has that collapsed as well? And that's a question that's unanswered at the moment. Experts will go in either later tonight or tomorrow morning, and we should hear more about that.
That was Seamus Kearney. He's a freelance journalist, and we spoke to him a couple of hours ago, so we've had developments ongoing since then. But just the true crown that he was talking about, the crown of thorns, that is the crown of thorns believed to have been worn, of course, by Christ at his crucifixion. Of course, this is Holy Week right now for Christians across the world. This is one of the most important, one of the most significant times of the religious calendar. Other important relics that have been saved are the true crown as well, parts of the cross, the true cross as well, parts of the cross that Christ was crucified on, relics that we believe have been taken out, they have been saved. And Seamus also talking about the possibility of experts going in to the cathedral later on tonight. They are indeed already inside. Water still being doused to bring the temperatures down. Those stonework still incredibly hot, and concerns, of course, to prevent any flames from reblazing, reigniting themselves. So water still being doused across. But what we are looking at there are some of the experts, some of the firefighters on the top, on the rooftops, and they're doing initial investigations to see the extent of the damage. The extent of the damage is bad. The roof has collapsed. We saw the spire collapsing in, but I can bring you some of the first images from inside. And actually, of course, yeah, you can see the flames at the top there, but the stonework is intact. And actually some of the intricate carvings into the stone does seem to be still in place. So yes, this is going to take, it took 200 years to build Notre-Dame. It will take a long time to get it back to its former glory, but there's hope there. You can see that there is hope, and the criticism that there were no helicopters, that there were no flying water tankers, something that Donald Trump had tweeted. Perhaps flying water tankers, in his words, could have been used. The French Interior Ministry Civil Security and Crisis Management Agency really quick to get in there and tweet in English, not in French, that all means are being used to bring the fire under control when the blaze was still extremely bad, but they stressed except for water bombing aircrafts, which, if used, could lead to the collapse of the entire structure of the cathedral. So the decision-making process was there, and as we can see, the structural work, the stonework at least, is still intact. Let's talk to somebody who knows far more about this than me. Craig Bennett is Director of Bennett Preservation. He's in Charleston, South Carolina. Craig, you've worked on preserving many major American historical structures. Where do you even begin with something that is 850 years old, something as iconic, as loved as Notre-Dame?
Oh, Kasia, first thing, you do no harm. And then immediately the French engineers, and they're wonderful engineers in France, in the UK, and the EU, these engineers will stabilize the structure, stabilize what's there if it's likely to be unstable. That's the very first step. After that, there'll be an immense amount of evaluation and investigation to determine how badly damaged is the stone, how badly damaged is the mortar, and that will vary all over the building.
Can I ask you, because of course Donald Trump was even asking, a lot of criticism was, a lot of people were concerned that there were no helicopters flying over, dropping water, these flying water tankers suggested by the American president. Would that have been a bad idea?
I suspect so. If you've ever been hit by a water balloon, you know that it's got some force to it. I suspect that anything that would drop a massive amount of water at any one time would potentially destabilize the structure.
Craig, when we were watching initially, when those flames were shooting up into the sky and we saw the spire come down, it almost felt as if this was an unsalvageable situation. But actually, from the pictures inside, it seems that, well, there is a lot of hope.
I agree. I really do. And I think there's immense hope here. And we've seen structures that were very, very close to collapse and have been saved. There are occasionally structures that can't be, but most of them look worse than this.
Have you ever worked on such an old building, Craig?
Nothing of this age. I've worked on some artifacts that were from the 2nd century, but most of the structures on which I've worked were built between about 1690 and maybe 1900 or a little later than that. And so this is really quite an old one.
It certainly is. Sorry, it's a bit mean question there. But in terms of when you look at when you start trying to rebuild something like this, when it comes to stonework as well, there was a lot of concern that Notre-Dame, that the pillars had been eroded down by acid rain. How do you start rebuilding that? Where do you get the craftsmanship?
There are craftsmen really all over the world who are able to do beautiful stonework. There are not that many of them, but as a matter of fact, we have actually an American College of the Building Arts here in Charleston, and yes, the fellow who teaches stonemasonry came from the UK, but there are awfully good stonemasons all around the world. They're a little hard to find, but there are good stonemasons.
Well, let's hope that they are watching and may potentially offer their services. Craig Bennett, Director of Bennett Preservation Engineering, thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you for offering us a little bit of hope as we watch those live images of Notre-Dame. And there are already experts, firefighters, and no doubt people there up in the rooftops looking. We saw flashlights earlier as they were examining the situation and the state of the destruction. But the most important thing is that the stonework is sound. So there is a possibility and no doubt the beginnings of some kind of operation in which to rebuild this building that means so much to so many different people. It is, of course, a deeply religious building, 850-year-old, with some of the most important religious relics from the Christian faith. It is a historical building. It has seen so much through France's often very turbulent history, and it is a cultural building. This means so much to so many different people across Paris, across France. The thousands of tourists that come and have their pictures taken outside. The live shots that we're seeing now are of specialists up in the rooftops with the flashlights, with the torches, making their first initial investigations, and I expect this will go on throughout the night, Rico.
And we'll have more from Paris.
I want to bring you back to our top story, the devastation, the fire that has been raging in Notre-Dame, in this very centre of the very heart of Paris. As you can expect, the French newspapers are, of course, leading with this particular story. Let's start with Le Figaro dedicating its whole front page to this photo of Notre-Dame still on fire. That blaze now under control, I'm pleased to say. Inside, the paper quotes President Macron as saying that I am sad tonight to see this part of us burn. Le Monde's newspaper's website headline also the spire of Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, and that just as that spire was collapsing in, then collapsing within the roof. It goes on to also quote President Macron and saying that he cancelled other arrangements. Instead of having a conference where he was going to address Gilets jaunes and talk about the economy, he went straight to the cathedral. And finally, let's look at Libération, which also carries a big photo of Notre Dame as it was then still in flames. And it quotes firefighters this time and saying that the fire might be potentially linked to the renovation work that had been taking place in the top. And so that was earlier on today. This is what is taking place now. Firefighters still very much working throughout the night. It is 2 o'clock in the morning local time. They're still dousing to make sure that the stonework is wet and damp and that no fire resumes. But also we've got every now and again you see some flashlights across the top of the building and there as well. So people up there, experts up there, trying to already establish the extent of the damage. And from the pictures that we saw from inside, a lot of the stonework still very much luckily intact. And the firefighters still dousing with water. Political, religious leaders, lots of people giving their reactions to the events that were unfolding throughout the day. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying, I'm deeply saddened to follow the events in Paris and see the horrible images of Notre Dame in flames. She adds, Notre Dame is a symbol of France and also our European culture. The British Prime Minister also, Theresa May, tweeting, my thoughts are with the people of France tonight and with the emergency services who are fighting the terrible blaze at Notre Dame Cathedral. President Trump giving his response, saying, so horrible to watch the massive fire at Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. God bless the people of France. I just want to pick up on Donald Trump because a little earlier he was suggesting that perhaps flying water tankers could be used, adding that people must act quickly. But the French Interior Ministry Civil Service and Crisis Management Agency very quick to retweet in English, not in French, that they were using all means possible to get the fire under control, except the use of water bombing aircraft, which they feared that if they were to use heavy loads of water could actually collapse the entire structure of the cathedral. So pretty quick to rebuke Donald Trump there. Donald Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, saying Notre Dame is one of the world's greatest treasures. It's in our nature to mourn when we see history lost, but it's also in our nature to rebuild for tomorrow as strong as we can. And a statement from the Vatican saying we express our closeness to the French Catholics and the population of Paris and assure you our prayers and are with the firefighters. Also, officials at Westminster Abbey right here in the UK, tweeting, devastated for our friends at Notre Dame and for the people of France. You are in our thoughts and prayers tonight. So just some of the many reaction coming through, Rico, from across the world about the devastating situation in the heart of Paris.
Let's now take a look back at the cultural significance of Notre-Dame. It has survived the French Revolution and 2 world wars. It has towered over Paris since the 13th century. Notre-Dame sits in the very heart of Paris on the Île de la Cité, an island in the middle of the River Seine. Well, the fire is believed to have started shortly before 7 p.m. local time, shortly after the structure closed to the public. Horrified crowds gathered along the banks of the river to watch their much-loved cathedral landmark burn. Fergal Keane looks now at what Notre-Dame means to France and its people.
In Paris, the most desolate of skies, smoke and ruin and history billowing into the air.
Fire crews from across Paris have come here to save whatever they possibly can. And the striking thing, standing among the crowds on the banks of the Seine, is just the silence, the quiet of people stunned by the destruction of not just a great French cultural artefact, but of one that belonged to the world.
Notre-Dame de Paris offered a vision of France that seemed eternal, even if the age of kings and emperors and powerful cardinals had long passed. It was built more than 800 years ago, when kings ruled by divine right. And grand and great cathedrals of stone and stained glass were designed to reach for the sublime.
So this is an absolutely cultural disaster for all of us, actually, not just the French, but also European significance. Paris had been the sort of hot cauldron of Gothic architecture from the 11th and 12th centuries, and it had influenced a whole lot of buildings in England, including Westminster Abbey and all our subsequent cathedrals.
Notre-Dame survived Europe's devastating wars of religion and the age of revolution. It was a theatre of hubris. Napoleon was crowned emperor here by the Pope. At the end of World War II, the bells of Notre-Dame pealed the hour of liberation. Its glories are a source of pride for the people of this city.
I speak to your English audience to share my immense sorrow, my immense pain in front of this catastrophe that has befallen Notre-Dame. I have lived here for more than 30 years. My 3 children were baptized here. What the Germans did not destroy was ruined by a stupid fire.
Higher and higher it goes, reaching up.
The fear of a devastating fire was always present. This is the mid-1930s, when the Paris Fire Service drilled for such an eventuality. But it was a renovation in the modern age that proved catastrophic. These statues were moved for protection just last week. Tonight, Paris feels like a city that is mourning the loss of an essential part of itself. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Paris.
So we've got the cultural, the religious aspect of Notre-Dame, and also we must remember the music. A little earlier I spoke with Margot Fazler. She's a specialist in medieval music. She's from the University of Notre-Dame, not in Paris, but in Indiana. And she just explained in the most mesmerising way just how significant this loss is to the world of sacred music.
Well, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, of course, has a medieval acoustic. And so that means that you have very high reverberation. So it's excellent for chant. And one of the most exciting times in my life, and I speak here as a medieval musicologist, I just want to express to all of our friends in France how devastated those of us in this field are at this particular moment, because the Cathedral of Notre-Dame is, in a sense, our homeland. And this is where so much of the music that is so important in our field was first composed in the late 12th and 13th century, during the very time that the cathedral was being built. There was the Notre-Dame school. And so the particular acoustic of the cathedral was something that we could test. It was over a decade ago that a group of us gathered, and we had a wonderful concert in the cathedral of music that was composed there. I wrote a book on some of the monophonic or single voice chants. And it was one of the most exciting moments in my life as a music historian and as a musician to be there at the moment. I can remember as a young American graduate student, when I first finally came to Paris and saw the cathedral, I fell to my knees and wept. I mean, this is our building worldwide. So those of us who are in the field of music are heartbroken. this has to do as well with those of us who are organists, because since the 15th century there have been great organs in the cathedral, and I'm sure that that's one of the major losses. Olivier Latry, who is the organist there in charge of the cathedral now, must be totally devastated, as we all are. The great composer Louis Vierne was there from 1900 to 1937, and he died at the console. He fell over and made his final note with his face on the keyboard. So we have such a history of music in that building, and our hearts and our minds and our souls are going out to the people of France and of Paris today.
Margot, we can hear the passion in your voice. What have we lost?
Well, I mean, the art historians can tell you what we've lost better than I can. I keep thinking of those 13th century rose windows. But you know, that cathedral was begun by Louis VII. And I wrote a book on Chartres Cathedral, and his wife was Chartraine. And that's why Our Lady of Chartres is featured there in the sculpture. So this history begins right in the 1160s. And the major part of the cathedral took about 100 years to be built. So this is the very time when it was that musicians were creating so much new music for that particular cathedral, which was dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. That is August 15th. And Louis VII had not been able to produce a male heir. And when he did, in 1165, it was Philip Augustus. And so it was this celebration of his own heir, his male heir, the only one he could produce, by this Chartraine woman, that led him to wish to have this monument and to connect it to the Feast of the Assumption, which was close to the time when his male heir was born. So much of the music is written for the Virgin Mary that we've studied. And it was there at the Cathedral of Notre-Dame that musicians learned how to write down precise rhythms for music, for musical repertory. And so the place of this cathedral as a cradle of our musical guild is very much tied to the innovations that the composers of the Notre-Dame school in the late 12th and 13th centuries led. And it's music that went throughout all of Europe. So for those of us who study European music, it's absolutely crucial. We find evidence of it in Scotland. We find it in Germany. We find fragments of this particular notation going out throughout Europe. And the music is glorious, of course. And so those of us who study music history, that's one of the things that we celebrate with our students and that we concentrate on. And we've always had that building where we could turn to it and think about its acoustics and think about the ways in which medieval music fit into it. You know, even though there have been many changes over time, we all know that. But still, to have it there has meant so much to us. So I pray that it's going to be restored, and I'm so thankful that the walls still stand.
Margot Fassler there, she's a specialist in medieval music, and I think she just summed up absolutely beautifully just what we will lose now that Notre-Dame is in the condition that it is in. Of course, yes, it's the religious importance of this building, it's the historical significance to France, it's seen so much, it's 850 years old, but there's also the element of the music, something that will never be re-experienced in exactly the same way. So my absolute appreciation for Margot Fassler for just talking us through it in such a beautiful way. So just to recap what has been happening, the fire is now under control. If we just have a look at some of the live images from the centre of Paris, well, throughout the night the firefighters will be continuing to work, but it looks like the water has actually stopped at the moment on one of them. I'm being told that some of the other pump is still going. The aim of that is to bring the temperature down in order to just prevent any other fires from potentially restarting. And you can see the flashlights there. Investigators will be throughout the night just seeing what is salvageable, the extent of the damage. But Rico, regardless of regardless of what they can salvage. And it is really lucky that they were able to get so many artifacts out. The devastation speaks for itself.
That's right, Kasia. This is indeed a cultural and historical loss. And, you know, personally, I am a Christian and a Catholic, and seeing the Notre-Dame Cathedral being engulfed by fire, I am really devastated and shocked. You know, I've been to the cathedral a few times. I've attended mass service there, prayed there, and about 3 years ago, even attended Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday services at the Notre-Dame Cathedral. And I'm really very sad to see this happening to an iconic cathedral ravaged by fire. I'm really sad and heartbroken. I mean, lovely works of art have been destroyed in this lovely piece of architecture in central Paris. It really saddens me to see what has happened to the Notre-Dame Cathedral, Kasia.
Rico, it's absolutely crucial just to remind everybody that, of course, this is Holy Week. This is one of the most significant times within the Christian calendar. But some of those really, really important relics that mean so much to Christians were saved. The true cross, a part of the cross that is believed to have been the one on which Christ was crucified, and also the crown of thorns that he wore at the crucifixion, which just mean, well, there are no words to explain the significance of this to Christians. They were saved. Many works of art were saved. So much wasn't, but the stone structure is safe. The investigators will now be looking to rebuild what is a building that has seen so much within its long, long history.